Our final lecture on ancient Rome is going to just dive pretty quickly into some of the legacies that Rome has left to us. So again, we finished with the last lecture asking the question, when does Rome fall? Does it fall with the sack of Rome in 476 AD? Does it fall with the sack of Constantinople in 1453 AD? Is it still around with us today? And if it is, in what ways? The textbook's going to get more in depth in this, and we did a kind of jigsaw activity in class on this. But in terms of fine arts, the legacy of Rome includes realistic sculpture. What we mean by this is, again, sculpture that looks like what it's supposed to be. And that's something that we see is going to have a big impact on Renaissance artists and sculptors who are going to come back and do that. The Romans are famous for their bas reliefs. We talked a little bit about this with the Parthenon, with the Greeks. A bas relief is 3D sculpture, but the rear of the sculpture is into the wall or into the structure that's coming out of. The major legacy that the Romans really leave to us and are very well known are their mosaics. These are small pieces of tile, glass, or colored rock that are then used to make a larger picture. And that's one of the big things the Romans use throughout. We've seen a couple different examples of these already in this unit and previous units. They're pretty famous for that, and they're frescoes. A fresco is a painting on the plaster on the wall itself. In terms of learning and literature, Virgil is a famous Roman poet. He wrote the Aeneid. That's the story of Aeneas fleeing Troy and working his way, eventually founding what will become Rome. And as we said, the Aeneid very much is playing with the Roman fascination and appreciation of ancient Greece, and it's very much written in the same vein and style of a Homeric epic. It's the Roman take on that. So it's a Roman, it's a Greek epic poem filtered through Roman ideas, and so that makes it a little bit different, but a classic in of itself. Ovid is a famous poet. He's going to write his Art of Love to be able to go in and describe how to be able to woo women and love itself. And then Tacitus is one of several. Plutarch is another famous historians that the Romans produce, and we learn a lot about day-to-day Roman life and history of Rome from him and others. The language of Rome is Latin, and the Latin language is obviously going to be spread with the Romans as they expand. And so we talk about many modern day languages having their basis in Latin, and those are the Romance languages from the Romans. So Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian are all just some examples of languages that have their basis in Latin. And usually, some people suffer over, me in particular, the idea that if you can learn one of these Latin languages, so or Latin foundational languages, Spanish, moving it over into understanding how French and Italian work is supposedly pretty easy. Obviously, some of the vocabulary changes, but the structure is pretty similar. The official language of the Catholic Church from its founding to even today is in Latin, where we're going to see masses performed within the Catholic Church performed in Latin into the 21st century. And English, obviously, in our language here at Joliet in the United States, is going to have a huge impact from Latin, as well as the Romans are moving into what will become Great Britain. And the textbook goes and identifies that over half of the words in the English language have a basis in Latin. Again, we asked the question, how are these eighth graders on ESPN in May so good at doing the spelling bees? They're learning a lot about the nature and the breakup of the words, and if you understand some of the rules of Latin, that'll help you learn some spelling. In terms of architecture, one of the key inventions and one of the key features of Roman architecture is the arch itself. We see that in bridges and aqueducts and buildings, repeated over again and again and again. It's in the word architecture itself to give you an idea of just how foundational it is to the Romans' conception of building. The Romans build domes. Again, if you think about, there's nothing supporting the middle part of a dome. That's the point of a dome. So to be able to do that takes some architectural engineering knowledge. The Romans very much use and perfect the use of concrete, of sand and gravel and rock and other binding agents to create concrete that will last through the centuries. A lot of the buildings the Romans make and are made out of concrete, and their concrete is so good it's replicated in modern day concrete in some ways today. The Roman roads, as we keep coming back to this, is very important for the Romans themselves, but as one of their great legacies as well as this road system that ties many major cities today, tied together many major cities within the Roman Empire as well. And then the final and most lasting contribution, we've touched on this before, is the Roman system of law. This is going to pop up in our day-to-day lives in the United States. It's going to pop up in many places around the world today because of what the Romans do. The idea that all citizens are equal under the law, that if you're a citizen, you have the right to be judged by the law, that comes from them. And we've touched on this, and we just again want to introduce the idea that Roman law will become church canon law. We'll touch on that a little bit with the Middle Ages coming up. Church canon law will spread with the Catholic Church, and as we particularly talk about the influence on the United States in your lives today, church canon law will be heavily influential in English common law. When the English settlers come to the United States and begin to settle there, that's going to bring their law code with them. You can very much draw a direct line from our United States law system, for the most part, back to Rome, and particularly the fundamental ideas of what it means to be a citizen of a Roman Empire or a citizen of the United States, and the laws and duties that you have restricting or protecting you. So we're going to see a lot of pictures here as we work our way through. Frescoes are, again, an important legacy of the Romans. And there's obviously, if you're putting windows into a wall, you're cutting a structural part of the wall out. So that's going to influence how high you can build. So it's a lot easier just to build solid walls. But solid walls on the inside of stuff is not that interesting. So the Romans would go a lot, we see this a lot in Pompeii, just because it's so well preserved, but a lot of paintings on the walls, and those are called frescoes. And these are pretty realistic, maybe not so much in subject matter, but in the perception of how they're perceived. Again, we usually ask the class, what is this? And peacock becomes pretty instantly recognizable from there. So again, maybe not in terms of the subject matter where you've got this kind of dragony figure here, but we can see the detailing on the snake's scales, the movement of the people here, the rabbit in size compared to the little cupid or cherub that we see there. And so that's what we see, and this is going to have, again, a big influence on particularly Renaissance artists looking back to the Romans and being influenced by this type of art. One of the key Roman kind of features of art is the mosaic. And if we zoom in on this particular mosaic and on the wall at the British Museum, we just want to emphasize this idea that these are small colored pieces of tile or glass or rock that, again, when we go and we zoom out, goes and forms a more complete picture. So again, zooming in, we saw in the previous slide with the mouth. Now zooming out, you can see the whole face and the design. In several steps, again, you're going and putting the lines down there, then you're doing the painted lines and you're grinding the floor with wax to bring it up. And you get the idea of the steps to do it. But we see a lot of kind of different sea and stuff. It becomes a pretty refined work of art to where if you go to the Vatican today, you go to St. Peter's in Rome, they've got artists who have been working for hundreds of years to put these extraordinarily detailed mosaics on the walls of that particular church. And they're getting those ideas again from the Romans. You see the chickens fighting in the top left, you got our skeleton on the right. And again, the detailing we can see in some of these is pretty fantastic as we move through the centuries, particularly on that lion at the top, the different shading there. The mosaics, we touched on this a little bit with when we saw that mosaic of Alexander the Great that was pulled out of the House of the Faun in Pompeii, is that these mosaics are also important in capturing the art from the time period. And some of the techniques the artists are painting with during the Roman Empire are lost, and we don't know what happened to them. And the only reflection that we get of those techniques comes from the mosaics that are recreating those paintings on the tile, on walls, and on the floor. And again, these are some things, and I particularly in terms of getting stuff onto canvas and painting and artistic representatives that we're going to lose for about 1,000 years from when Rome kind of falls to the rise of the Renaissance. So in particular, you see these ducks on the pond here, and we see the ripples of the water as well as the reflections being rippled. And that's an artistic, realistic kind of technique and observation that this artist has put into this floor mosaic that we won't see in art in Europe until, again, back until the Renaissance. We see these mosaics all over the place. The Roman resort town of Baiae has kind of been consumed and fallen into the sea, and you can go scuba dive and see mosaics on the floor. And then they're still finding these all the time. On the left was a farm field. I forget exactly where, but it's a farm field. Farmer was going digging, and all of a sudden, wait a second, I'm on top of a old Roman villa, and you can see them pulling out there. And this is the Shard in London, one of the tallest buildings in London, if not the tallest building. You can double check. You got Google right there on your computer. But again, in the shadow of the Shard, they're still pulling up here from Roman Britain these mosaics, and that just kind of gives the length and breadth of the empire, what they're doing. Bas relief is similar to what we go and we see here. This is off Trajan's column that the Emperor Trajan does to go and show his victories in Galatia. But again, the idea of a bas relief is it's 3D. You can feel the bumps on the guy's nose, but you can't walk around it because this is the column base itself. So that's where we go and we see that again. Realistic sculpture becomes a key sculptural idea of the Romans that will be eventually picked back up on in 1,000 years with the Renaissance. Those are the famous Farnese bulls. Comes out of the Baths of Caracalla. This is one of the largest freestanding sculptures made in the Roman Empire that at least stands the test of time and is around for us today, with a little bit of restoration work done by Michelangelo when it's first pulled out of the ground. Those are human-sized humans on the bottom here. And I mean, this is me holding my phone up to take this picture about eye level. So you give the idea, the sense of scale that this is amongst the different people and the subject matter there. These are the famous runners that are of Pompeii, and again, the realism of this, very much kind of a continuation of that Hellenistic style of sculpture we saw at the end of the Hellenistic age. In terms of learning and literature, we talked about Virgil and the Aeneid, as well as Ovid's Art of Love. Tacitus is pretty famous for his writings, and again, we want to mention Plutarch's Lives. He's a pretty famous Roman historian that's going to have influence throughout all of history, particularly as, again, a history class. We talk about the Romance languages in Europe, and those Romance languages are not ones you speak because you're going to do pitch some woo or have some romance with anybody. It's the idea that, again, they are Roman based, and it makes sense because these are areas heavily dominated and controlled by the Romans for a long time. They have Latin in those places. As those places kind of separate during the Middle Ages, for reasons we'll get into, we see the languages go in different directions, but the base is all in Latin. And if you can learn Latin, it becomes a easier jump to these languages, say, than going from like Mr. Cranmer English, still struggling with high school Spanish. The arch is again one of the key architectural features of the Romans, and we see arches throughout their architecture, throughout their engineering, as well as building triumphal arches to represent and commemorate different victories or people or monuments there. One of the things that arches are used for is, say, the Pantheon in Rome, which is not the best picture to show off the dome that this stands. And this is the largest freestanding dome in the world when it's construction, when it's first built, and then it becomes one of the largest domes in the world, particularly in Italy, until Michelangelo's dome for the cathedral in Florence before St. Peter's Dome goes and surpass it. So again, the big idea with the dome is that there's no central supports. It's a big open space in the middle, and that takes a lot of different engineering. And again, that's all made out of stone, so there's a heavy weight to that roof that you've got to be careful you're building up. And again, Rome has survived multiple wars, bombings from the air, earthquakes, and this still is able to stand. And it kind of is a testament to the engineering. And again, we ask the question, well, what's holding up that dome then? Lo and behold, it's a series of arches underneath made out of bricks to support that concrete dome and give you that open space of the Pantheon. That was a Roman temple, then a Christian church, and has been used for different things over the years. So we finished up with the fall of Rome in the last slide, and as we're kind of ending our study of Roman, we want to be able to understand that as we move from the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages, there's this transitional period where there's still vestiges of the Roman Empire, and a lot of these different Germanic tribes, as they're breaking in there, are trying to grab hold and use the Roman Empire as their basis, as their justification for why they should rule and why this other guy shouldn't. And that's what we go and see. Again, in our essays, when we're asking, does the Rome fall with the fall of Rome? Well, if the key characterization of Roman civilization is its urbanization, and you have no cities anymore, is this Roman civilization? And those are questions we begin to answer, but we can't answer that question that it's still around today in the East. And what we see very much with the rise of the Eastern Empire and its rise and falls over the years, it becomes one of the great continuations of this idea of Rome into here 600 years afterwards, and then into the Crusades, as again it goes and expands and contracts over the years to where eventually it'll just be in Constantinople. So as we're finishing up here, we want to go and we're going to take a kind of sidestep. We're leaving the GIF to show again the expansions of why in the East the Ottoman Empire, we see the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and we see the contraction of the Kingdom of Rome, Constantinople, and that's due to the rise of the Muslim peoples. And that's what we'll get into a little bit in our next unit, where we do a quick jog through Byzantine history, Islam, and Japan. So hope to see you there.